Hey guys, my name is Will Gilmore. Today I'd like to speak to you about hamstring strain injuries and Nordic implementation in Major League Baseball. If you've ever worked in sports or are a fan of sports, you've definitely heard about hamstring strain injuries and you know that they're a huge part of the game. But did you know that they're the most common injury in all of sport? This is true even in elite soccer, where 37% of muscle strains are from the hamstrings. And even in a sport like baseball, where there is much less running than soccer, hamstrings still account for nearly 7% of all injuries. Occasionally, the media will catch the injury bug themselves and will hype up these current cases. But contrary to what is popularly reported, the number of injuries and days missed in pro baseball have remained fairly steady from 2011 to 2016, as you can see in the camp graphic down at the bottom of the screen. In a study conducted by Timmons, the primary mechanism for initial hamstring injury was high-speed running. And actually, the reoccurrence of injury also occurred in this same manner. It is believed that the hamstrings are required to contract eccentrically during the terminal swing of the gait cycle. And having low levels of strength and length at such a critical phase of the running stride can lead to acute injury. Now, nearly 89% of these injuries occurred in the bicep femoris long head. Interestingly, during deeper research, Timmons found that for every half centimeter increase in bicep femoris fascicle length, hamstring injury risk was reduced by 73%. They also found that in terms of eccentric strength, injured players had on average weaker hamstrings than healthy players, as you could probably expect. So let's talk about some norms in Major League Baseball. The norm for hamstring injuries in baseball is 13 per team per season, with 260 to 290 days missed between the major and minor leagues. This accounts for almost 7% of all injuries and almost 6% of all time missed throughout baseball. Now, if you're a trainer, May is by far your scariest month, as this has the highest incidence rate. And together, April and May combine for nearly 40% of all injuries throughout the season. It's been hypothesized that this is due to the cooler temperatures during those months, but more research is needed in this area. Also of note, 20% of major leaguers and 8% of minor leaguers were suffering reoccurrences of their initial hamstring injury. And with major leaguers being generally older than minor leaguers, this could be a risk factor at play, as hamstring injury risk tends to increase with age. As we've seen in other studies and other sports, most hamstring injuries in baseball occur during high-speed running in the late swing phase of sprinting. It's been noted that baseball players may be at risk due to the prolonged periods of standing around and the need for quick intermittent accelerations. In this sport, a guy can go from sitting on the bench for 5 minutes, walk up to home plate, and then have to perform a max effort sprint down to first base. Because of this, 62 to 71% of injuries occur while base running, with the vast majority going to first base. And as you can see in this picture of Adam Jones at the bottom, players will occasionally lunge at the first base bag when trying to beat a throw. At this point, the hamstring is eccentrically stretched as far as it can go, and he's got a forward-leaning trunk. So when that body comes down on the front leg, the result can be way too much force for one muscle to handle. Now, going back to the Timmons study, they were able to break down injury risk into modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors. It was found that injured athletes were significantly older than non-injured athletes. The injured athletes also had shorter bicep femoris long head fascicles and were weaker eccentrically when tested during the Nordic hamstring exercise. This eccentric strength and fascicle length account for 30% of prospective risk. 30%. Which ends up leading us to Nordics as an intervention. In a study with almost 300 soccer players, Bourne found that players that followed the 13-week protocol of Nordics were 69% less likely to have a hamstring injury than non-participants. Even when done at low volumes, with as little as 8 reps per week, participants had an almost 30% increase in eccentric strength. This is similar to what Seagrave found in baseball, where a minimal compliance of 3.5 reps per week was critical to avoid injury. Now, Timmons is quick to point out, too, that when done at low volumes, muscle architecture can be maintained by performing high-speed running. This is an extremely important note for baseball, as it might be easier to convince players to perform max effort sprints before games than to do Nordics multiple times per week. So now you may be wondering, why Nordics? Why not traditional hamstring exercises like RDLs and leg curls? Well, the research has shown that Nordics lengthen bicep femoris long head and simultaneously increase eccentric contraction strength, which are the two modifiable risk factors identified in the Timmons paper. It's even been found that age and previous history with hamstring injuries can be mitigated by increasing levels of eccentric strength and lengthening the fascicles. So why don't teams use these then if the research so heavily supports their benefit? Well, it turns out that baseball isn't the only sport that has this problem. A study that Barr and friends conducted found similarly low levels of compliance in Norwegian Premier Football. This is actually pretty ironic considering that this is exactly where the Nordic hamstring exercise originated. Nonetheless, they found that 83% of teams were non-compliant with the program. The main fear that scared players away was the idea of playing with sore muscles the next day. Seagrave notes this same sentiment in his analysis of baseball. In baseball, because guys have to play every single day and only have 1 or 2 days off a month, compliance of Nordics is extremely low due to the fact that they don't want to play the next day with those sore hammies. So the question becomes, how do we overcome these barriers? Well, implementation comes down to a few key points. And Kate Beersworth discussed this in terms of ACL prevention programs, but is the same nonetheless. The first step is to educate the coaching staff and the players in a framework that they can understand. Kate's quote was, "Coaches want trophies and players want performance." Our staff needs to understand that Nordics will help keep their best players on the field. Our players need to understand that injury prevention is synonymous with performance enhancement. Now, the next step would be fidelity. We got to stick to an Nordic intervention program long enough to see the full benefits manifest. And finally, we need to demand compliance during our training sessions every week. As noted, as little as 3.5 reps per week was critical to avoid injury. If we do this and ensure that our players are consistently running at high speeds, then hopefully we'll be in a much better place and avoid players looking like this. Thank you very much for your time, and here are my references for this presentation.